Hey guys, this is Blue Forest. I hope you're well. So today I'm doing part 2 of the anti-tier list where I'm doing some in-depth analysis of nearly every bot by class. Like I said in the last video, I am not going to be ranking them from best to worst. That's for you to decide. With your own testing and experimenting, I just want to give you some more information that might be helpful when you're deciding which bots to use and rank up. So a few things about the Brawler class. Number one, they're kind of a complicated class in the sense that they all have massive strengths, but they generally have at least one or two very noticeable holes in their kits. They have their downsides for sure. On top of that, several of them have somewhat unique and kind of different play styles that can be tricky and difficult to master. And so you really want to test these bots out before you're taking them up to rank 6. This is true for bots in general, but particularly for the Brawlers. You know, you want to test them out because some of them will feel really good to you. Others you might find to be pretty frustrating, okay? And I should finally mention about them that purification is all over the place, which is unfortunate. So a few of them purify almost everything. Some of them don't purify at all. So you do need to bear that in mind when you're using the Brawlers. So let's jump in and start with MV1. So MV1 is a very simple bot with a simple kit. It is not complicated at all. He's one of the easiest bots in the game to use, and for that reason, he is well liked by both new players and experienced players. He is very strong both offensively and defensively. He's got an okay SIG. It's not my favorite because it only activates once per fight and it's only 7 seconds long, which is kind of unfortunate, but it does give you some protection. You are nearly invincible when you drop below 90% health or 20% health for 7 seconds. The nice thing about his SIG is that you do get the additional melee buffs as well as the armor, so you can do some serious damage during that window, but more importantly, you don't need to invest in his SIG because the armor is the same at SIG 1 or 100. But looking at his general kit, he gets a guaranteed armor buff, which is pretty good every time he blocks. And you can refresh that over and over again. It gives him up to about 16% block proficiency, which is pretty good. He has a 10% chance to get a melee buff with all attacks, so 10% is low. But because it can happen on all attacks, you will see it activate relatively often when you use him, especially in longer fights, and it increases his damage by up to 60%, which is quite good. His specials are very solid, all of them, but especially his special 1 and 2. They can all bleed, and so he's a good bot to use deep wounds with. His special 1 will increase damage based on lost health, so it's great to use when you're at low health because it will do up to 150% additional damage. His special 2 is also very reliable. Special 3 is fine, but most people will focus on his special 1 and 2. And then I should also mention his willpower ability, which is unique to him. This is his healing ability with bleeds. So MV1 is not a general purifier. He's not going to purify shock or burn, anything like that. But he's fantastic against bleed bots. And so with willpower, depending on rank, he can recover up to 35% of the damage he inflicts when he's bleeding. So this takes some practice. You need to get the hang of it. You need to learn how to time your attacks when you're bleeding because that's the only window you have to heal. Excuse me. But once you get good at it, you can do significant healing with him. I mean, there are videos of him going from 100% down to 10 or 20%, back up to 100%. It's pretty amazing, and it makes him a safe choice and a very strong choice against bleed bots. Synergy-wise, he has a lot of good attack synergies with bots like Tronus and Demotron. So he's a very well-rounded bot in the sense that he's easy to use, he's not complicated, and he's certainly worth investing in. So that brings us to Grindor. So Grindor is a bit of a dark horse. The main downside with him is that he doesn't purify at all, and I really wish he did, at least in some circumstances, but he is a dark horse because he's actually pretty good. He's a very defensive bot, maybe the most defensive kit in the game. He's got massive armor. He has both passive armor and he can get armor when he's attacked, so he's super tanky. He's got pretty high health. This is why he can be very annoying to fight against because he just doesn't die easily, you know, and so This is great for newer players or if you get hit a lot, or even for experienced players. As long as you're not going against a DOT bot, he will survive for a long time, okay? He also has really good crit rate debuffs that he can get when he's attacked, but more importantly with his special 3. So in longer fights, you want to use the special 3 first because that will inflict a permanent 16% crit rate debuff on the opponent, and that's pretty helpful. His specials overall are fine. Like his special 3 has that debuff. His special 3 isn't the most powerful special. His special 1 isn't that powerful either, but his special 2 is amazing. It can do fantastic damage, especially when you pair that with his SIG. So offensively, he doesn't have the greatest base damage, but it can be seriously amplified with his SIG. So Perforate increases his melee damage based on the amount of power that the opponent has. The nice thing about his SIG is that you don't need to get it too high for it to be meaningful. So even at SIG 20, he's getting about 85% additional melee damage or up to that amount based on the amount of power the opponent has. And that's pretty fun. He is very much a melee-based fighter. So if you like melee fighters, he's a very good choice. And his playstyle is a bit risky. It's kind of like walking a tightrope. There's an element of risk involved because you want the opponent to have power in order to do more damage. But there is always a chance that they'll be able to redline and kill you. However, that is very relevant to his special locks, which work in tandem with his SIG, right? So he can special lock with all of his specials. His special 1 can special lock the special 2 and 3 of the opponent. His special 2 can lock the special 3. And his special 3 has a guaranteed special lock on the opponent's special 2 and 3 for 10 seconds. I wish the chance was a little bit higher for the special 1 and 2, but they'll still activate often enough. And so he has a playstyle where you want to do a lot of melee damage when the opponent has a bar of power or more, and then selectively use those special locks. So some people don't really like that. Other people find it exciting. So he's one that you would definitely want to test. And I also want to mention his decreased block proficiency on opponents. And so that means that when you hit into the opponent's block, they will take more damage than with other bots. That's pretty useful actually, you know, because bots do end up blocking pretty often. So you can do more damage than any other bot when you're hitting into their block. Synergy-wise, he's not that good because he's a movie Decepticon, but if you like to use Demotron, Barricade, Bone Crusher, you know, he fits right into that kind of team. So that brings us to Thundercracker. Okay, so TC, very debated bot. A lot of people will say he's the best brawler. Some say he's among the best in the game. That certainly can be true. The thing about TC, though, is that he is a skill-based bot. You've got to be not only a good player, but you've got to really learn how to play well with him. He takes time to master. It's not going to happen overnight. So unlike a bot like MV1 that's really ready to go right away, TC takes time and patience. And for that reason, he's really a long-term investment bot, okay? That's for 2 reasons. The first is his SIG, okay? So his SIG is absolutely critical because unawakened TC is not a very good damage bot. If he's not awakened or if he's at very low SIG, you're not going to see huge damage. But with his SIG, you know, he is all about his melee buffs. And the thing about his melee buffs is that they can be stacked indefinitely. There is no limit. So in longer fights, you can stack dozens and dozens of these and do some of the biggest damage in the game. The thing is, though, you need to learn how to really stack those buffs and not lose them, and that takes time. Because you're gaining a 7-second buff with every 5 consecutive hits. So this is a bot that you really want to be using lots of 5-hit combos with. But because they are only 7 seconds, you need to make sure that you're not losing them all the time. And so you need to learn how to refresh them, which you can do with melees, but also with sidestepping, and most importantly, with blocking. Blocking is also an important part of his kit. He has built-in block proficiency. He also has heavy block with his blocking when opponents use ground heavies, right? So if you're at 15+% health and a bot like RC or Mirage do a heavy on you, they will just bounce right off of you, which is very nice. However, the most important part is that you really want to learn his well-timed blocks. You need to learn how to parry because they refresh the duration of his melee buffs. They keep him active and going for longer periods of time, which is really important, okay? So with him, you want to do a lot of 5-hit combos, then do a well-timed block, then do another combo. If you do that, you can really stack up those buffs and do just amazing damage, okay? His specials are good overall. His special 1 is fine, but it's good because it's a bunch of hits, so it can kind of add to his hit count and keep those buffs going. Special 2 is mind-blowing, especially with lots of buffs. So there are videos of him doing 150k, 200k damage just with his special 2. Special 3 is fine, not that great, but he does shock on it, which is nice. But I should also highlight his purification. So he's the best purifier in the game. He purifies everything except acid, so he can purify dazed and backfire. Unlike Grim, you just use a heavy. So for that reason, you know, he's widely used by experienced players on the left side of AMs. You know, his purification is fantastic. You know, it's so worthwhile. It's so useful, especially against, you know, bleed bots, shock bots. He also does not crit, right? So that makes him amazing against Bone Crusher. Instead, he gets a melee bonus on the damage that he would do when he would crit. When he purifies, he does inflict burn. So he has some decent DOT with burn and shock. But the bottom line with him is, like I said, long-term investment. So if you're willing to spend months building up his SIG, getting used to playing with him, mastering him, he will be one of your best bots for sure. If you're not so patient, he's probably not going to be the best choice for you. So that brings us to Motormaster. Okay, MM has a very simple kit as well, largely based on Unstoppable and debuffs. Okay, Motormaster, very fast-paced. You want to be aggressive with him for sure. The biggest downside for him, kind of like Grindor, no purification at all, which is unfortunate. So you don't see him a whole lot in high-level AMs, but he's very fun to play. He can be exciting, and he can certainly do massive damage. He does have pretty high health, so he can take a punch, but obviously his Unstoppable is very important. So every time you dash, you get Unstoppable. You can get this over and over again. It gives you protection. But also his debuffs are really strong. So on his heavy and his special 3, you can get attack debuffs. And that makes his heavy really useful because you apply one of 3 debuffs, either attack, power rate, or armor break, and they last 6 seconds, and you can apply them over and over again, which is really cool. His specials overall are good. He has a pretty weak special 1. Special 2 is very good. It's strong. Unfortunately, though, he gets an Unstoppable buff, which is kind of silly considering that he already goes Unstoppable so much. His special 3 is a monster special. It does massive damage, and you inflict 6 of those debuffs. Unfortunately, though, you take a hit. So it's the only special in the game where you take damage when you use it. So you need to use it very selectively. And then I also want to mention his SIG. So his SIG is good, but it's also really frustrating. It's a polarizing SIG because he gains a melee buff for every 20% of health lost. So you're only going to see his SIG in action when you've taken damage. Some people kind of like it, some people hate it. Depends on your playstyle, okay? But because he's gaining more melee damage every time he loses 20%, by the time he drops to 40%, 20%, he can do absolutely phenomenal damage. So the question is whether you're willing to play with a bot that's really going to benefit at lower health, you know, so that really will just depend on your preferences. But otherwise, like I said, he's fun to play with. He's pretty powerful. The Unstoppable is very exciting. And synergy-wise, he's actually quite good, okay? So he has some good attack synergies with bots like Wheeljack, but also he has Enforcers, which is a very underutilized synergy. So with Ramjet and Kickback, that extends the duration of debuffs, but more importantly, debuffs cannot be purified. Okay, so if you use that team against a bot like Grimlock, they won't be able to purify. That's really good. Okay, so he's a good choice if you like aggressive playing, you know, really fast-paced, that kind of thing. So that brings us to Tantrum. Tantrum also has a very sort of specialized playstyle that's also polarizing. A lot of people can't stand it. Other people think it's really fun. That's because his movements are restricted. So as you may know, he gets a melee buff every time he dashes at the opponent. These can be stacked up to 10, okay? when he has 10 buffs, he can be one of the biggest damage dealers in the game. He is very strong, very powerful, and he's also very tanky. The problem that people have with him, though, is that every time you backstep, you lose all of your buffs. So your movements are kind of restricted to dashing forward and sidestepping. There is a workaround, there is a remedy to avoid losing the buffs with his Unstoppable. Okay, so as you know, you can charge up his Unstoppable. He goes unstoppable for 4 seconds. You can apply it multiple times in a fight. And when he's unstoppable, he can dash back. But that means that you have to really learn how to use him, how to apply Unstoppable selectively so that you can get out of the way at important times. So that will really depend on whether you're willing to try a very different play style, because you do need to be quite aggressive with him to keep those melee buffs up. You know, he's the kind of bot that you might end up taking some damage just by playing super aggressive, but he can do some of the biggest damage in the game for sure. He does have a stun chance with his heavies and special 2. That depends on the amount of buffs you have. Same thing with burn on his special 1. His special 3 is one of the best in the game. You can take opponents from 100 to 0 with buffs. He also goes unstoppable after that. So it's a very powerful special. And then, of course, I should mention his SIG. It's very good. He gets increased crits, but more importantly, it gives him his purification. So he has limited purification. Every time he gets 3 melee buffs, he goes into Frenzy and purifies everything. So that's nice, but he doesn't purify more generally. So he's only going to purify in certain circumstances. Synergy-wise, not so great. Some basic ones with bots like Cyclo, but honestly, he doesn't really need them because he's very strong, he's tanky, he's got armor, and he can do massive damage. You just have to really decide whether you want to invest in his sort of play style. So that brings us to Primal. Obviously, the most important thing to say about Primal is that he's a Beast Wars character, and he's the centerpiece of it. So if you like to use bots like Cheetor and Scorp, you have to use Primal, really, because you want to be able to take advantage of that synergy. If you're not using those bots, I mean, you can use him as a standalone bot, but most people won't. But Beast Wars, best synergies, you know, among the best synergies in the game for sure, and he is the most important part of that. But Primal, also a very defensive bot, kind of like Grindor, and that's largely because of his armor buff. So he has crit armor buffs that can also be stacked up to 10. He gains them passively every 6 seconds, and he can also get them when he's attacked, so they're very easy to accumulate. The nice thing about them is that they reduce crit damage to 0, which means that you will not land crits on him at all when those buffs are active. That makes him extremely tanky. He can take a lot of punches. That's why some people really love him. He's just so strong that way. Damage-wise, he's pretty average at base. He can do a ton of damage in specific circumstances, but that's not what he's known for, okay? So his special 1 will always bleed when he has already been bled in the fight. His special 2 is very good bleeds, and he often will bleed. His special 3, however, is really unique in the sense that it has a very strong defensive component. So what that means is when you use a special 3, he automatically gets 10 armor buffs. And he applies an attack debuff on the opponent that lasts 32 seconds. Very long. So if you use that in a longer fight, you will get a ton of protection because you'll get those armor buffs and the opponent will have reduced attack. That's actually very useful. On top of that, when he is blocked, so when you attack, the opponent blocks, he has a chance to get a melee buff. And then in terms of his biggest damage potential, that's when you want to convert those armor buffs to melee buffs with his heavy. So in longer fights, you want to use his heavy selectively because his heavies automatically convert armor buffs to melee buffs. And that's where he can do some of the biggest damage in his ability. So overall, like I said, very tanky, very strong, very defensive, and the centerpiece of the Beast Wars team. If you're not using Beast Wars, you're probably going to find some benefit in other brawlers, but he is certainly a very solid bot. Finally, that brings us to Grimlock. So Grim is similar to TC in the sense that he is an all-purpose purifier, purifies everything except daze and backfire. He's easier to use, though. So his purification is passive, meaning that you don't have to do anything. And his kit is just a little bit simpler than Thundercracker. So some people will use Grimlock first before they use TC. Grim is also all about the melee buffs because they also can be stacked indefinitely. And when you have a lot of them, he can do unbelievable damage. His Sig is obviously essential because that's what allows him to purify. He does not purify without it, but also he gains melee buffs whenever he's debuffed, and the strength of those melee buffs increases with his Sig level, okay? Now, he can also gain a melee buff when he's attacked, but the point is it's very easy for him to stack those buffs, especially when you're going against DOT bots, which is obviously what he was really designed for. His specials are actually quite good. His special 1 and 3 will always burn, and his special 2 is really powerful. It hits like a truck, but more importantly, he gains a melee buff for 5 seconds with every special. And the strength of that melee buff increases depending on the special that you use. So he's a bot that you want to use a special and then hopefully land a combo or something like that because he will do more damage. His heavy is also very strong because it's unstoppable. So he goes unstoppable. He takes no damage when he's in that Dinobot form, and he has a good chance to burn on the heavy, which is pretty nice. But I should mention, though, the big hole in his kit, the big problem with Grimlock, is that he has serious issues with missing hits. Okay, so Grimlock has a lot of reach advantage with that sword of his. So that means that when you're at a distance, he can land even when he's fairly far away, and that's fantastic. The problem with him is when he's close to the opponent, he will often miss those sword attacks, okay? This is something that a lot of people have brought up over the years. There's something about his design, his hitboxes, where you're going up against a bot, like let's say you're doing a raid, you face Wheeljack on Harm Accelerator. When you're up close to Wheeljack, oftentimes, even when you're perfectly timed, he will swing that sword and just miss over and over again, okay? Air punching is a very real thing in this game. Whiffing, you know, missing hits. Sometimes dashing doesn't work. You dash halfway. You end up getting countered. Like, that's a very big reality in this game for all bots. But with Grimlock in particular, he tends to miss a lot when he's close to the opponent, which is very unfortunate. Some people don't really care or don't see it that much. Other people find it extremely irritating. So it's just something that you have to bear in mind with him. And then finally, I do want to say that he has the highest health in the game. So at rank 6, with synergies, with relics, he can have well over 50k health. And so he can also definitely take a punch because he lasts a very long time. And he has some nice synergies with the other Autobots in particular. So that's it for the Brawlers. I hope this is helpful. Like I said, you really want to test these bots out. Practice with them in some difficult fights before you decide to pour a ton of resources in them, and then maybe decide to rank up a few of them. You know, you might need to do that in the end. So I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will talk to you all next time. Take care.